Thank you so much, Professor Miller, for sitting with me today. I'd like to just talk to you about a few things that I know you know a lot about, Zionism and the Israeli lobby, how that lobby may use public relations to further certain political ends, and your experience at the University of Bristol, and perhaps how that's changed your outlook as to the role the university actually plays in society. It might be appropriate to maybe open with this question. What is Zionism? And perhaps drawing from your expertise as a sociologist, how might we understand Zionism sociologically?
Well, Zionism is just a nationalistic ideology. It's often said by Zionists it's a very complicated matter and we won't really understand it and we shouldn't really talk about it. But there's no real dispute about what Zionism is. It's the idea that there should be a Jewish state in the historic territory of Palestine. And now the Zionists think this is a good idea, and anti-Zionists like me think that's a bad idea, because of course it means intrinsically that you have to displace the people who are already there, the indigenous population of the area, the Palestinians. And of course that's what happened in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. The Palestinians, 750,000 of them were displaced, many killed, villages destroyed, and the Jews took their place, the Zionists took their place. And that's what Zionism is. It's an ideology which says that the state must be of Jews. There must be a majority of Jews, that the Jews must be able to determine what goes on in the land, and that the Palestinians, by contrast, must not be able to do so.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you've done some work on this, and I'm wondering whether you can speak to it as to the extent Zionism connects, if at all, to Islamophobia.
Well, so because the Zionists had to push out the Palestinians in order to create a Jewish state, they had to be anti-Palestinian and they had to be anti-Arab, of course. They didn't see themselves, those who had that background didn't see themselves as Arabs. They were mostly, of course, Europeans. And as a result of that, they also, because the Palestinians are mostly Muslim, not all Muslim, but mostly Muslim, they also had to be anti-Muslim, and that's a kind of part of the basic genetic code of Zionism, if you like. But when we look at it in recent years, you can see the way in which the Islamophobia, which has enveloped the Western world especially since 9/11, since the attacks in 2001 in the US, that kind of Islamophobia, the idea that Muslims are somehow backward, that their politics is reactionary, that they treat women badly, and that they're particularly prone to violence, those ideas don't just come from the US and from the Islamophobic movements that people will know about, but they also come in large part from the Zionists, because they were the ones amongst them who invented some of these ideas. And I will give you two examples. The idea, first of all, of Islamic terrorism was invented by Zionist intellectuals. In particular, the first place this had a major public showing for the first time was a conference in 1984 in Washington, D.C., organized by a certain Benjamin Netanyahu. And the idea there, which is one of the earliest appearances of the idea, was that there's a specifically Muslim form of terrorism, that Muslims are particularly predisposed towards terrorism, and this was an idea which was advanced to replace the idea that the main forms of terrorism in the world came from the Soviet Union and its proxies. So there's one idea. The second idea, which comes from them, is this idea of Islamism, this idea that Muslims uniquely want to bring their religion into politics and that they all do it in the same way, such that, for example, Al-Qaeda or ISIS are just the same as Hamas or the PLO or any other Muslim organization which is engaged in defending itself against occupation, for example. Now that clearly is a manifestly ridiculous way of seeing things, since of course some Muslim organizations, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, are engaged in fighting against other Muslim organizations. But that's an idea, the idea that Muslims are all the same and that they are politically reactionary, they will turn to violence. These are ideas which have been developed and pushed by the Zionists over many, many years, since the 1980s in most cases.
And I'm wondering whether you have any insight on why these liberal democracies or sites of power or governments that identify as liberal democracies seem on the one hand to be reckoning with their colonial past, but when it comes to Zionism, when it comes to Israeli state, settler colonialism, why there seems to be such a reluctance to go there?
Well, because in many cases, the colonial interest and direct colonial interest is something which is of the past. So there's no direct colonial interest in the British reoccupying India or the French reoccupying Algeria. There is a direct colonial interest from the Zionists in continuing the occupation of Palestine. And so that is supported by Western states, in particular the US, but also the UK and Germany, partly because the Zionists are a key part of the counter-terrorism or security apparatus of those states. It's not just a question of Israel as a nation state influencing other nation states, the US and UK, for example, although that does happen. Mm-hmm. It's that within the counter-terrorism and security apparatus of the UK, of the US, there are large numbers of Zionists, of card-carrying Zionists, some of whom, of course, have dual citizenship with Israel, and that means, of course, that they tend to put Israel first above the interests, for example, of the US or the UK. So that seems to me to be the reason. It's a matter of practical current mm-hmm. concern to maintain the occupation and settler colonialism in Palestine, whereas it's not in Algeria or in South Africa or in India.
So often when people talk about Zionism now, I hear them talking also about what's called the Israeli lobby. Can you tell us a little bit what the Israeli lobby is and whether its messaging is primarily one of advocacy, or does it amount to something like dangerous propaganda, or is that too much of is that an overstatement?
Well, I think you have to understand that the Zionist movement is a social movement, a social and political movement, which is transnational. It has been transnational from the very beginning, since the 1880s. And what people refer to as the Israel lobby is a small fraction of the Zionist movement. It's the lobby groups, for example, in the UK or the US, which directly try and influence policy. So AIPAC, for example, in the US, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League in the US, or similar organizations here like BICOM, the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, or the Community Security Trust, which does what the ADL does in the US and the UK. These are Israel lobby groups. Mm-hmm. But the wider Israel, so the wider Zionist movement is something which is much more significant. So at the level of propaganda, these organizations that I'm talking about in the Israel lobby, they do engage in messaging and propaganda, nefarious activities. They farm trolls on the internet, and they try and destroy people's reputations. So that's all of the aggressive stuff that they do. And if people know about this, this is well documented in many reports and documentaries. But the thing which I think is more important in a way is the wider context in which this takes place in the Zionist movement. So the Zionist movement itself is based around four key, what's called in Israel, national institutions. And they are there to develop the Zionist project, which means, in particular, getting land to settle on, finding settlers to live on the land, and raising the money to do that. And the four key national institutions are organizations which do that. And part of their purpose then is not just to lobby for pro-Israel politics in the UK or the US or anywhere else. It's also to indoctrinate and socialize young Jews into seeing that genocide is an appropriate way of approaching Palestine. And that seems to me to be an incredibly important element of this. So the attempt to suggest to Jews that they have a birthright, that young Jews from Manchester or Liverpool or from London in the UK, that they have a birthright to the territory of Palestine. Now that's plainly ridiculous, but that is the ideology, and that ideology, of course, inculcates the idea that the people who live there, the Palestinians, don't have rights to the land, and that they can be cleansed, ethnically cleansed, displaced, or indeed killed, as we see in Gaza today. The open, naked genocidal statements of very many people across the whole of what's called Israeli society. That's what the Zionist movement is there to do. It's there to inculcate and promote the idea that genocide is a natural and a sensible way to approach the Palestinian question.
I'm wondering, I mean, you're speaking to it already. I'm wondering the distinction between the Israeli state and the Israeli lobby. How careful should we be in making it, or how tightly enmeshed are they in actuality?
So the Zionists often say you shouldn't use the Z word, you shouldn't use the word Zionism because it means different things to different people. To some Jews, it's just a sense that they should have some kind of homeland. But of course, having a Jewish state, a homeland in Palestine, ineradicably means ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. So I don't think we should be careful. But it's perfectly plain what Zionism is. It's a social movement which wants to establish Jewish dominance in a particular territory, the historic territory of Palestine. Now, of course, we can make distinctions between the Israeli state and the institutions of the Israeli state, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister's office, the key elements of the Israeli state. When we talk about the Zionist movement, I've mentioned already the national institutions which form the Zionist movement. And they have a peculiar status. They're referred to as national institutions, but they're not state institutions. They're referred to by this curious term, parastatal institutions. So they do carry out state functions, but they're institutionally supposed to be separate from the state. So that means that, of course, for example, the Jewish National Fund, which is responsible for stealing Palestinian land, which has branches in the UK, the US, and in about 20 or 30 other countries around the world. This is an organization which in those countries seems like a non-governmental organization. Doesn't seem like necessarily a sort of an arm of the Israeli government. But it of course is, and it has a curious status as a result. So of course we can make these distinctions, and we can make the further distinction that within the Zionist movement there are specific lobby groups that perform particular functions. So for example, some do more public relations work, others do direct lobbying inside government. In the UK, for example, there's the Conservative Friends of Israel and the Conservative Party, and Labour Friends of Israel and the Labour Party, which most MPs in those parties now are members of. And then, of course, you also have a whole series of other organisations which are Zionist directed, but which may not claim to be Zionist or may say that they've got some other functions. So you have a whole series of organisations, for example, that engage in what's called interfaith, which is trying to make sure that Jews and Muslims and Christians get on with each other. That's the name it gives on the outside of the tin. But in reality, of course, they're hoping to draw the sting of criticism that they might get from especially the Muslim community, which is most likely to be critical of the occupation of Palestine, and to try and mute and make sure that the opposition that there is, for example, in the UK, is undermined. So there's a whole range of different organisations which have different functions.
I don't know how far back you like to go with this. I know so much has happened over the last few years with respect to your experience at the University of Bristol, but I know that not too long ago that you were involved in proceedings, trial proceedings that are related to that, and I was wondering whether you can share with us what they were about and the extent to which the Israeli lobby perhaps had any bearing on it.
Well, I started working at the University of Bristol in September 2018. A month later, I was doing a meeting for Palestinian students in London, a small private meeting, and the Zionists sent a spy to the meeting to record it, and then they publicised what I had said, which of course was unexceptional. I was talking about the definition of anti-Semitism and how that was being weaponised by Israel. So within a month of me starting at the University of Bristol, I was being attacked by the Zionists. 2 months after that, I gave a lecture on Islamophobia, where I talked for a few minutes only on the role of Zionism in encouraging Islamophobia. It's not the only factor that encourages Islamophobia, but it is one factor. And some students went to an Israel lobby group, the Community Security Trust, who made a complaint to the university, which was rejected because the CST is not a student. The CST then recruited a Zionist student group to complain, and they then recruited the head of the Bristol Jewish Society, a Zionist group which is part of the Union of Jewish Students. And they made a complaint, and that complaint was accepted because the head of the Bristol Jewish Society was a student at the University of Bristol. They then investigated me with an external QC, now called a KC, who came along and did a big investigation of me, and by December 2020 had concluded that there wasn't a single thing that I'd ever said which was in any way anti-Semitic, and that parts of the students' complaint were, and I'm quoting, manifestly hopeless. So this is a joke, fake complaint which is made on behalf of the Zionists. So I was given a clean bill of health, not required to do anything in response to it, and 6 weeks later I went to a public meeting and I referred to the fact that I had been, and I'm quoting again, attacked and complained about by these two individuals, the heads of the Bristol Jewish Society and the head of the Union of Jewish Students. And after that, all hell broke loose. There was a huge campaign to have me sacked because using the words attacked and complained about was somehow targeting and bullying students. Plainly ridiculous, but something like 20 or 30 different Zionist organisations, which most people in Britain would struggle to name that many Zionist organisations, complained about me. There were questions in the House, there were debates in the House of Commons. Over 100 members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords wrote to the university calling for me to be sacked. Zionist professors at my university called for me to be sacked. And I was investigated, and again I was found not to have said anything anti-Semitic, obviously, but the university decided that I would be sacked because I had upset students. That when I had talked about Zionism and Islamophobia, that was upsetting to Zionist students, and that I shouldn't upset Zionist students. And so they sacked me. I then took an appeal, it was rejected. I then went to court to what's called an employment tribunal in October last year, and we had 2 months of hearings. I was in the witness box for 2.5 days. We now await the judgment of that tribunal, which we anticipate should be out at the end of January or the beginning of February.
Before we wrap up, Professor Miller, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts or observations that you'd like to add.
I mean, I think look, we're in a period of a sort of rapid transition from unipolarity to multipolarity, and we saw that with the Ukraine conflict, and we've seen that with de-dollarization. So even the Saudis now don't use dollars for oil purchases. And we're also seeing it, of course, in relation to what's happening in Gaza, the emergence of a regional conflict involving Yemen, Iran, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon. These are signs that US power is waning and waning rapidly. And I think that the horror of the genocide in Gaza is something which will stain the reputation and the idea of Zionism forever. There is no way of putting that back in the box. And so I suppose we're in a period where something significant is likely to happen as a result of this. It could be, as I would prefer to be the case, the end of Zionism as an ideology and the dismantling of the racist Israeli state, creation of a Palestinian state for all of the citizens of Palestine. And I think that we are in a period of hope, notwithstanding the sheer horror every day of the genocide in Gaza.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller, for this excellent discussion and your time with TRT World today.
Thank you.